Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's session of the Soul's Code. So I'm with my co-host, Lorilet, and we never really know what we're going to talk about until a few minutes before the show, actually, because this is what we do on a day-to-day. So we try to explore different aspects, and we don't like to really script what we talk about because we want that human connection. We think that's what's missing in a lot of healthcare today. So, um, there's different things that encompass speech and learning and linguistics and cognitive functions, part of it. So, of course, nutrition. So, we're going to talk a little bit about that piece today, about kids that really have difficulty eating. And it's very sad. And there are specific protocols and programs they have to go through to learn how to chew again and to do all these things that we're talking about. Even kids that have had car accidents or head traumas, sometimes they suffer through this. They have to learn how to do everything afterwards. I know when I was at Blightdale, that was something we saw pretty regular. So we're gonna get into it. So, my lovely, what do you think of that?
Oh, I think that's awesome. I one of the issues that we find is that sometimes parents don't necessarily right away recognize that there's a feeding issue. And so when parents don't understand that right away, they may delay getting the help. But generally, for example, when a child is born premature, this is one of those areas that are of concern, you know? And so typically, if a child is premature, then services most likely are a given.
So when you talk about prematurity, so um I would think with women that are going to breastfeed, there'd be difficulty latching on, especially with like
Mhm.
specifically like kids that have cleft palate or things like that. They would certainly have difficulty with feeding and things like that. And you know, they because there's a noticeable difference there. They would be referred out right away. But I think
Absolutely.
there's other kids that are having difficulty latching on, and people might not think that it's a delay. They might just think that there's, other issues, or the child's just not latching on, and they might keep pushing it, and there might be another problem. And the parents sometimes, might think that they're doing something wrong instead of seeing that there's another issue, right? So,
Yes.
um, when would be a good time for, so I know, like, if they're having certain foods, like if they're already on soft foods and it's not bottled, hopefully it doesn't get to bottle, because I would think that they wouldn't be growing at a normal rate, or within the range for their age and size, because I know they look that at with kids, they're that they're hitting those parameters. So hopefully that would be seen, that they're not gaining weight and there's an issue. um but if
Yeah.
it's missed there, when the child starts having solid foods, there might be some pickiness or some I don't know, like discontent when eating. I don't know if that's a good word to say, but they're not really enthralled in what they're doing. They're kind of distant from the feeding. And a lot of times it might be cognitive, um, because they're not getting that nutrition, and that could have started with the delay that nobody noticed, because fatty acids and like, choline's great from eggs and things like this. These are all things that help cognitive function, right? Though, just like we eat with adults, the omega-3s, the nuts, the lean proteins, all those things are important in kids too. So, and it will affect their linguistics. So, um, and their eating. So, how would how would a parent know? What kind of signs do you think they should see or be aware of if they're listening to this?
Mhm. Well, you covered a lot of different things. First, first of all, when a child, for example, is born, if they're having a problem with latching on, usually there's a lactation specialist that can support the mom in the process of helping that child, if you will, learn to latch on and successfully be breastfed. If that doesn't work, then there are different protocols in terms of nipples that are used to then do formula feeding. But a lactation specialist would actually manage that aspect of it when
Hmm.
they're really babies and newborns. Now, let's say that the parent takes the child home and, they did not get a lactation specialist because now they're home and everything was fine and the baby was breastfeeding. Initially, it starts off with a lot of coughing. You might notice a lot of coughing in babies, and it's like, it's almost like they're choking each time. So if you notice those kinds of signs of choking and kind of turning red, and when they're eating is almost like something is off about their suck and swallow in terms of eating, their food, whatever it is that they're having, whether that be milk or if it's baby formula, when they're at the level of baby formula, you want to start noticing what is happening as a child is eating. One of the things when I used to do work with children like this, is to notice their pattern, their rate of intake. The rate of intake matters tremendously. I remember having worked at the Shield, at a location, at a place, and one of the clients there, the consumer there, they would not have good pace of intake. The rate of intake was so fast that it wasn't safe eating. And so those are all kinds of things that you would start looking at, not only the suck swallow response in infants, not only the rate of intake, not only if they're coughing a lot, but also their demeanor while they're eating. Those are key things that you kind of at the basic level. And if that starts happening, then you would want to have an evaluation. A feeding evaluation would then happen where the child would be exposed to different consistencies. One of the things that we do in speech therapy when we do a basic evaluation is to see, can the child have solids? Can the child tolerate, for example, biting on a cookie and chewing it, or something semi-solid like when we have yogurt or applesauce. Usually the very safe would be applesauce. We also try to see, okay, can they take a thin liquid, something like water or apple juice, because those are safe to consume. And if you aspirate, you're not in trouble as much as you would if you're taking something else. Not that we want to expose a child to anything that would be toxic, but just kind of be mindful of that. And if you notice again that the suck swallow is not coordinated, that the breathing is not coordinated, that they're choking or turning red, or you know just ask for help, right? Like, don't just try to think it's going to go away, because sometimes it doesn't go away. Especially, for example, if there might be a neurological involvement, as it happens with adults, like in the case of a stroke, you know. And then at that point, you really need to be evaluated for dysphagia. Dysphagia is when a person has difficulty swallowing,
Yeah,
and
we have a lot of patients over the course of my career that could only have thickened liquids and stuff like that. But we've also had where people have a diagnosis of dysphagia, but it didn't affect them with eating, where they could eat. And you
right,
know,
because dysphagia doesn't mean that you can't eat anything. What it would mean is that maybe there are certain consistencies. For example, a person who would be on a thickened liquid, it means that they have a difficulty managing thin liquids. So if I give them water, I can give them ice chips, I can give them a thickened type of nectar level, and it's nothing that's going to change the flavor of the food. What it does is changes the consistency. When we think about feeding, we think about taste, temperature, and texture as kind of these mediating aspects of how you manage that that food, because if it's too hot, it might cause a cause of concern. The texture, if it's the inappropriate texture, can also be a problem. So, and the taste, if the taste is a taste that is too sour or that is too sweet, or, those are all kinds of things that may impact the rate of intake, or if a client is going to, basically accept that or not. But I remember also treating a child at one point that had a G tube,
Mm,
and it was just, I had to work really hard in supporting that child to be able to then, be better without it. Over the course of my career, while I haven't had that many children in school systems or in private organizations needing direct feeding therapy, because usually when a child needs feeding therapy, they are in a facilities that have other supports, um, because feeding issues may be indicative of more types of needs than
yes.
just like speech. Feeding is so critical because we need to survive. We need to be alive. And if a child is not thriving, right, we say failure to thrive, if the child is not thriving, then that's also a cause for concern, not only from a medical standpoint, but also from just being able to be productive and show up for school. That's not a priority. Schooling as a typical schooling process is not the priority. Survival is. So,
Yes,
you know,
absolutely. Survival first. And
yeah,
failure to thrive, there's definitely a cognitive component at that point.
right.
It
There's a
is
more
going to
involvement.
affect, yeah, there's going to be a problem with them learning and being educated because they're just not thriving. They're not getting the nutrients they really need to sustain adequate life. So you
Yeah,
do worry.
yeah,
Um, so I mean, I want people to understand. So a lot of people like, if I tell people that I'm a nurse, they kind of have a general idea of what I do, not necessarily all of the things that fall under our umbrella,
right.
because we're social workers and advocates and
Yeah,
all the
people don't realize the many
no,
layers that come into the delivery aspect
yeah,
and the level of sophistication that's required. And when I say this, it's at the point of entry, right? Point of entry of the support service to be provided. Even for us as speech language pathologists, we have to find an appropriate entry point so that we can be effective. Otherwise, that can kind of really make everything a lot harder for it to happen.
yeah. Yeah. So but I want people to understand that speech is just not just linguistics. It's a lot because nutrition is part of that, and you do have to work with other disciplines too. Because we were talking about being able, I think I don't know if it was last week, but on one of our shows we were talking about that you have to know what's in your scope and what to get that help with. So knowing your scope makes it easier to know when you have to look out of it. And even though certain things aren't in our scope, we to practice and give it, like I'm not gonna start, teaching people how to eat. You know, because it's just, you know what I mean? So,
Right,
but I would know if I heard them choking. I mean, these are things that I've experienced where I had to get this, certainly I have to call the speech thing, she's having trouble. Every time she eats, she's coughing. I've seen this over
right,
my career, right? And
right,
we had to put them on thickening liquids for safety until the speech eval could come in and see her,
right, right,
and so but I think that when we know that scope and we know when to refer out and how to really collaborate as different members of that team, that that's when the patient needs are really being met, because sometimes people can't express their needs. I'll never forget a time that there was a man that I worked with, and he had a stroke. He was in one of our facilities, and he always loved when I was on duty. And the other like nurses and the aides, they didn't understand that. And one day I was in a room and he asked for something and I handed it to him, right? And he shook his head and said, thank you. And she said, how did you know what he wanted? I said, because he told me what he wanted. She said, but he doesn't talk. I said, well, there's more than one way to communicate. I said, if you lost your speech, because this man used to be a principal at a school, he was an educator for years, so he knew how to communicate. That was his role at his job, to communicate and get through to other people, right? So I said, well, when one of your senses is taken away, and I said, if you couldn't hear tomorrow, you'd still be use your other senses to acclimate and learn how to survive in the world, wouldn't you? She said, I didn't see him do anything. I said, he used his eyes. He was looking right at me and went over there. And he looked. And when I picked it up, he was like, yeah. So I said, it's a no-brainer, right? So,
Okay,
so
for you, it was a no-brainer because you were so
I was
clear
listening to
in
not
making
just
sure that you got this person, meaning you wanted to make sure you got it, that this person was well, that this person was listened, that this person was well attended to. And it has to do with going a little bit the extra mile, where those nonverbal cues are there right in front of us, but we have to pay attention to be able to notice them as opposed to just stay on the surface, right?
well,
So,
it's weird because it seemed like he was always calling out to me. Like, and people like, how could he call out to me if he doesn't speak? But I knew the sound of him even when he screamed. It was so weird because he he did have tone. He just no words came out like, "Arr," like so I could understand by the level of his tone whether he's angry or he's mad. Like if I came in with a "Arr," then I knew something happened and I would follow him. I'd say, okay, let's go. And he would show me what happened or what he was looking for or something. So he knew I was very willing
mhm,
to satisfy his needs. But I remember one day he fell and I heard him clear as day calling for help. And I ran down the hall and there he was. He fell out of the bed, and he had difficulty because of the stroke. He couldn't get himself back up.
right.
And like one of the nurses saw me running and just started running behind me. And she saw him and she goes, how did you know? I said, I heard him. She said, he doesn't talk. I said, yes, he does. I can hear him. So they
Yeah,
they thought I was nuts, but you get used to how other people communicate.
absolutely.
Like certain people, well, I've known people that were verbal, and if I said, are you doing okay? They would just go, like, and not say, yes, I'm doing fine. How was your day? They would use gestures to communicate what they want, you know?
Mhm, mhm.
Um, so you have to be willing to explore other people's worlds if you are going to be a part of it and interact with it. And a lot of people don't get that. A lot of people feel like if they don't understand or he can't speak or like now they have more devices than they used to, ways that people can communicate. Than they had many years ago, but they if you're listening, people do talk. I remember being I think I was still in nursing school and they were teaching all the students and they wanted you to see as many things as you can. And I think it was the teacher who said to me, and you have an ostomy, we'll go in there and do care. I said, I don't think that's a good idea. And she asked me why not. And I said, because she hasn't gotten herself to look at it yet. So I don't know how much she's going to enjoy 9 students staring at standing over her and looking at it when she herself hasn't accepted it yet.
Mhm.
So she said, okay. But she called me aside later. She goes, it was very, she said, I'm really pleased with how perceptive you were of her feelings. I said, well, they tell us, we have to watch out for those things, because they're not grieving, because it is a loss, and you have to make sure that their acceptance of that loss. You wouldn't send somebody home, you know, um, that's grieving dysfunctionally or not ready to be on their own to care for that. And
Mhm.
that to me was very clear that she wasn't going to be discharged the next day because she still couldn't look at it. How is she gonna,
Take
care
care
for
of
that
it.
ostomy? She's gonna be back here in a week with an infection.
Mhm. Mhm.
Or if it strangulates, how would she know? Because she hasn't looked. So these are things you always, I mean, so we talked about verbal and nonverbal, but there's always other signs. People are your biggest indicator to what's going on with them. And even though a lot of people don't openly express what's going on with them, if you're watching, you can kind of tell by their mannerisms what their body's saying, if people, like, you can even tell when people are hesitant about going home and if they're going to be okay on their own, when they're not running out of the door, oh, thank God I'm getting out of here, have a nice day, thanks for your care. And when they're, looking out the window and like, do I really want to go home, or they're hesitant,
Right.
so there's different things, I remember a man that came in for an amputation, and he wasn't dealing well with that first amputation at all. But it turned out that they didn't take enough, and they had to go back in the following week and take more, right? And that actually turned out to be better for him, even though he didn't see that at that time. I certainly wouldn't. If it was a below the knee and then it became an above the knee. And um but sometimes you can make that difference. I said, before you would have just not had a foot, and it would have thrown off your gait. I said, but now you're a great candidate for an extension. You can have a leg. You can walk without that gait, right? And he said, "Oh, they'll give me a leg." I said, "Oh yeah, they'll give you a leg." And his whole world perked up, and he was very excited to get fitted for that leg, and smiled all the way out of there. It didn't happen overnight, but there's always a way to help. You just have to look for that way, you know. So with speech and feeding, and if you, it doesn't really matter. I was on a call with an acupuncturist today that does so many different integrative, health.
Mhm.
And there's so many things that he's doing in his wheel well, and because he made it his business to learn other different aspects, because he is of the same mind we are, that it all encompasses health, right? So he made it his business to learn all these other therapies, and he does work with functional nutritionists and things like that. So he does send people out that aren't in his wheel well, but if he can do cryotherapy and acupuncture and massage therapy, then he's going to do it, right? To give that person a better perspective and a better approach. So,
Right. That would be more of the someone who prepares themselves for those type of holistic needs. I was thinking about back to the case of when a parent brings a child whom, they are wondering about feeding issues. And one of the other related disciplines that would be great in terms of collaboration would be the occupational therapist. In the past, when I've had cases, often the occupational therapist would also support children, or individuals who have feeding issues, particularly with the motor aspects of the feeding and the sensory aspects, such as like even holding a spoon or the utensils properly, or bringing food up to the mouth, or the sensations. Sometimes the textures, as I had mentioned to you before, impact how a child or an adult or a person with a disability experiences the feeding process. And so they may avoid certain things, and it's like I remember having conversations with parents regarding building that exposure, because the exposure is huge to different textures, for example, but also doing it so safely. You have to do this in small ways. You can't just go in there and expect it to be fast, because it's a process to just train the child to know how to do the chewing and the rotary motion. And sometimes that's not happening. And when there's like a cognitive involvement, specifically, for example, that could not be happening naturally. The actual
Mm,
chewing is not there.
yeah.
You may see a lot of drooling. I remember, like, when I've worked with little ones and they're drooling, that tells you a lot, not only about the tone, right? And they have these fatty cheeks, even though they're like 4 years old. And you're like, wait, that's supposed to be like the fat pad when you're a baby, but they're so underdeveloped, that the presence of the oral cavity itself, the way it looks, the aspect of it is very infantile, very underdeveloped. And so you would need to work on building up that
The
ability,
muscles
you
and the
know.
muscles.
Yeah, because there's weakness. Usually when there's low tone, there's motor, oral motor weakness. And the aspect of chewing and feeding is a demand on
Mm,
a weak structure. But the same musculature, right, is what's used for speaking. So this is why they kind of dance together, right?
mm,
But the initial aspect of why we have our oral cavity is really for feeding, for survival. But if you're having a problem with your oral movements, your tongue, you're not elevating your tongue, you're not cupping the food, you're not retracting, you're not able to do these movements that you need to manage, the bolus in your mouth, you're not able to manage the food, whether that be, after you chew it, make it into a bowl and be able to swallow. We have issues. We
mm.
have issues. It's going to start trickling into other areas. So occupational therapists, I've worked with them closely for that. I've worked, if there's a nutritionist involved, sometimes the child may have a particular protocol for their meals. And so I remember I had one student who was very particularly difficult because I had to feed her 5 days a week that she was in school. And, just building her up to be able to get her to have diced uh, pieces of food was a process in itself. It couldn't be like right away, as much as parents get eager and they want their child to have all this, you have to do it safely.
Yes, of
You
course.
can't,
The
there's
steps.
no speeding
Everything's
it
a
up.
process,
This is not about speeding it up. There's no speeding highway for it,
especially not with chewing.
not with
A
that.
lot of
And
risks involved.
many risks. Exactly. It's so risky. And so for me, this was really a serious task because no one was able to feed the child. So I had to do it 5 days a week. There was no one there that could do that safely. And so, I've had some cases that have been more challenging than others that I think at that point, the best way is to refer out to be able to provide the child with more holistic, right? Kind of like what we were just mentioning before. Sometimes a child has more global involvement, right? In different areas, more than delays. There might be neurological
Mm.
issues that need to be
But they
addressed
should be
in a medical
evaluated for all of
facility.
them. They should be
Absolutely.
evaluated. It's always safer to rule it out than proceed with
Yep.
caution. It's always better to rule it out. So, because it's a process of elimination, you might find, you know, things you weren't looking for,
Exactly.
and you might find out that it's not as bad as you think. So ruling it out has its, its benefits, right?
It's
So
the best.
so health is all based on risks versus benefits. What are the benefits to the child and what are the risks, or to the adult, right? So you always want to weigh them out and do no harm, do the best that you can do. So
Being alive
I'm
is a priority. Being alive is a priority over having conversations and talking. You
yes, so
know,
I can do without speaking to a few people, but I couldn't do without you.
exactly. So this is why if a parent is having like trouble with this, they shouldn't be like, "Oh, let me wait it out. Let me see. Let me." No, do not go around trying to figure that out on your own. Really seek professional guidance. Really express your concerns to your pediatricians. First of all, because every child usually has their pediatrician when they come out of wherever they're at, whatever facility. So it's really critical that they don't try to like let's wait and see approach with that. Those are not things that we wait and see. We go ahead and ask for evaluations.
Always. So I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope that it helped someone somewhere. These are things we're trying to really find out how we can really advocate for these children and these situations and adults because the age is different, but the bodies are the same. So adults and children suffer from the same things. And if you can help the child or help the adults, whatever we could do to bring awareness to some of these difficulties. So, because parents might not know that their child's experiencing difficulties, and maybe they might hear that cough and say, "Oh, well, didn't I hear her say that a cough is
Just one of
not a good
those.
sign?"
Yeah.
That's an alert. Things like that, and in the elderly, when they start declining, a lot of times they will lose interest in food, and that's different. But we do have to have them evaluated and make sure it's a disinterest, or maybe they're losing, they are declining cognitively, and how we can step in there too. A lot of Alzheimer's and dementia patients tend to lose interest in their food because they don't remember they have to eat at a certain stage. And we want to step in there too. So there's a lot of different indications for why people would need speech and help with not just linguistics, but feeding. So I hope this served you in some way. I want to thank you and my fabulous co-host for popping in, and we hope you have a great day. Take care.
Thank you, everybody.